It's the early morning of August 29th, 2022. In the occupied city of Kherson, which is currently under the control of Russian troops, a barrage of JMLRS guided missiles strikes the command post of the Russian military. The ammunition and vehicle depots in Berislav, located on the territory of the machine building plant, are under a similar strike, as well as military objects in Gavrilivka and Lvove, which were most likely the places of troops' concentrations. Ukrainian missiles also pound the Kakhovka dam bridge. Such strikes that aimed to isolate Russians on the right bank of the Dnipro River were quite common during July and August, and significantly degraded the main Russian supply lines through Antonivka car and train bridges. However, the strikes on August 29th are abnormally numerous, because on this day, Ukraine begins its major counteroffensive to retake the city of Kherson and sweep the only Russian lodgment area on the right bank of the Dnipro River. But first, let's briefly touch on the events that preceded the first Ukrainian major counteroffensive. On February 24, 2022, Russians attacked Ukraine from the south, entering through annexed Crimean Peninsula. Without a doubt, from the first hours of the invasion, the situation on this particular theater was critical for Ukrainians. Due to either sabotage or incompetence, most likely both, Russians quickly advanced on the land part of Ukraine, meeting only disorganized resistance. Following three main directions of attack, invading forces reached their first key objectives in the first weeks of the attacks, securing bridges across Dnipro River, the city of Kherson, Nova Kakhovka, and Energodar, as well as reaching Mariupol on the east. Mykolaiv was also almost encircled after Russians expanded their bridgehead near Kherson. However, by the end of March, logistical issues and the reorganization of Ukrainian armed forces halted further Russian advance. They were repelled from Mykolaiv, but maintained control over Kherson and a quite significant lodgment area on the right bank of Dnipro River. During the summer of 2022, the front line here more or less stabilized, as Russians organized the defenses along the Inholets River and the network of small irrigation canals. For now, both sides struggle to advance across plain fields surrounding the city of Kherson, and only small villages occasionally change hands over the course of the summer. However, this is about to change. Understanding that they have limited time until the second half of the fall brings rains that will turn solid ground into mud, the Ukrainian command accumulates significant forces around the Russian positions here in August. They appoint Andriy Kovalchuk, the head of the Operational Command South, to plan an offensive that will involve somewhere between 20 to 25,000 troops. To sweep the well-entrenched enemy, Ukrainians decided to attack in 5 different places. On the south, the Ukrainian 28th Mechanized, 124th, 126th, and 231st Territorial Defense Brigades will engage near the M14 highway, which leads directly to Kherson. There, they will face the Russian 126th Coastal Defense, 127th Separate Reconnaissance Brigades, 33rd and 255th Regiments of the 20th Motor Rifle Division, 331st Airborne Regiment of 98th Airborne Division, and LPR's 4th Separate Mechanized Brigade. The forces of the Ukrainian 17th Tank, 63rd Mechanized, 121st Territorial Defense, and 59th Motorized Brigades, as well as the 131st Separate Recon Battalion, will assault Snihurivka, the crossing of multiple important roads, and nearby towns. It is defended by the elite 171st Separate Air Assault Battalion of the 7th Mountain Air Assault Division and a part of 205th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. The purpose of the main Ukrainian attack, however, is to try to cross the Inholets River in multiple locations, enlarging their small bridgehead here in the direction of Sukhий Stavok to create conditions for potential split and encirclement of the Russians. This task is given to the 35th and 36th Marine, 46th Air Mobile, 24th, 61st Mechanized, and 57th Motorized Brigades, with the support of multiple smaller units such as Ukrainian Volunteer Army, Terror Battalion, 108th, 109th Territorial Defense Brigades on the flanks. They will face the 247th Air Assault Regiment of the 7th Mountain Air Assault Division, 34th Mountain Motor Rifle, 11th and 83rd Air Assault Brigades, which will be backed up by the 124th Separate Battalion, 104th and 234th Air Assault Regiments of the 76th Air Assault Division, and DPR's 109th Regiment. 2 auxiliary attacks will be conducted from the north, with forces of the 73rd Naval Center of Special Operations, Separate Special Purpose Battalion of Chechen Volunteers, 129th Separate Territorial Defense, 128th Mountain Assault, and 60th Mechanized Brigades, which Russian command plans to repel with forces of 10th Separate Special Purpose, 45th Spetsnaz, as well as part of 205th Separate Motor Rifle and 810th Naval Infantry Brigades. Ukrainians also concentrate a significant amount of artillery on the north, organized into quite mobile 45th, 55th, and 406th Separate Artillery Brigades and Separate Artillery Group of 17th Tank Brigade that will support Ukrainian assaults in different directions throughout offensive operations. To offset that, the adversary concentrated 227th Artillery Brigade and 140th Artillery Regiment, which are similar in strength. From the Russian side, General Sergei Surovikin was appointed as the commander of the 25,000-man large southern grouping of the Russian armed forces. The defense of the Kherson is his first strategic mission in this position. Quite an unusual role for someone who served as the commander-in-chief of the airspace forces for over 5 years. The most vocal about events around Kherson, however, was the deputy head of administration of the occupied region, Kirill Stremosov, a collaborationist who readily conveyed the Russian point of view on the unfolding events. Coming back to August 29th, the intensive strikes of HIMARS missiles also reached positions of the regular Russian army, while Ukrainian attack aviation rapidly increases the number of sorties, targeting the air defenses and troops concentrations. Ukrainian forces on the ground started active battles along the whole front line, focusing efforts near Sukhy Stavok as a part of their crucial plan to enlarge their lodgement area. As mechanized forces start pouring on the other bank of the Inholets through pontoon bridges in Andriivka, Russian paratroopers retreat from the positions here. They also abandoned the 109th DPR regiment that was stationed with them. Facing Ukrainian Marines, the DPR unit, consisting mostly of conscripts, is destroyed on the same day, allowing Ukrainians to attack Sukhy Stavok. The village of Ternovye Pody, which was in grey zone for a while, is also secured. On the other parts of the front line, the advances are more modest, as Kiselivka and Pravdine change hands multiple times. Due to formidable enemy defenses, Ukrainians also failed to cross river near Davydiv Brid. On August 31st, the Ukrainian Special Purpose Battalion of Chechen Volunteers breaks through defenses on the north and captures Arkhangelsk, threatening to cut the only road Russians can use to supply troops in Vysokopilya, where the active fighting persists. In these conditions, Russians are forced to slowly retreat, leaving Olhine and then Vysokopilya by September 4th. Ukrainians also make territorial gains around Ternovye Pody, advancing towards Kiselivka. At the same time, Russians lose the village of the Kostromka, near Inholets River. The footage indicates that Marines there used Turkish Kirpi IMVs and T-64 tanks for successful assaults on the entrenched Russian paratroopers. Further advances towards Bruskinske hint that Ukrainians want to cut the only Russian supply line to Davydiv Brid to increase chances of the crossing the river there. However, regrouped Russian reserves prevent this, pushing Ukrainians back to Kostromka in brutal assaults across the fields. On September 2nd, a Russian counterattack forces Ukrainians out of Ternovye Pody, freeing the front line here for a while and erasing earlier gains. Around this time, HIMARS strikes collapse a bridge span in Novakakhovka, one of the 3 main supply lines across the Dnipro River. The second and third supply lines, Antonivka car and train bridges, are under daily rocket strikes for a long time, so Russia started relying solely on pontoon river crossings that are often targeted by Ukrainian long-range weapons as well. The Russian retreat from few villages in the north allowed Ukrainians to attack Novovoznesenske from multiple sides, capturing it by September 6th. Ukrainians also actively assault adversary positions near Tarnovi Pody and Novograd-Neve, preventing Russian command from throwing forces from here to the north to regain lost positions. On the Ingulets River, Russians focus on destroying Ukrainian pontoon bridges, since the slowly expanding lodgement area of the attackers starts threatening Russian forces to the north. They conduct a counterattack near Blagodativka, threatening to outflank Ukrainians and directly attack the vulnerable river crossings. The attack, however, is not successful. For the first time in a while, Ukraine started actively using Bayraktar TB2 drones, which may be a hint that a significant fraction of Russian air defense systems in the region were suppressed by HIMARS strikes and HARM missiles adapted for Ukrainian MiG-29s and Su-27s fighters. The photos and videos of the destroyed Russian SAM systems that appear systematically in the media supported that. This allowed Ukrainian Air Force to conduct more airstrikes on Russians, further increasing pressure on them. Not without losses, however. On September 7th, a Su-25 of the Ukrainian Air Force is shot down in the Mykolaiv region. The pilot, Vadim Blagovitsny, is killed in this combat mission. However, as things slow down in the southern front line, striking opportunity rises not here, but in Kharkiv region. Ukrainian command immediately exploits that. On September 6, Ukraine launches a surprise counteroffensive near Balaklia in the northeastern Kharkiv region. From the very first day, there were many significant differences in this operation's course and what was happening around Kherson. Accurately described as open door and solid wall scenarios, they were still inextricably linked. Preparation for counteroffensive in the south were underway earlier than the preparations for the events in Kharkiv region. Thus, back in the August 2022, Kyiv conducted an incredible information campaign to buy time and ultimately confuse the Russian commanders. Officials of the various levels, journalists and military officers in the interviews claimed that the counteroffensive actions of the Ukrainian side will be focused on the deoccupation of Kherson. Russian command took the bait and transferred their elite paratrooper and marine brigades, as well as divisions to the south. The northeastern front was depleted of professional Russian units, which were replaced by smaller and poorly trained ones. This, coupled with artillery strikes on the military infrastructure of Russian armed forces in the southern Ukraine, played into the hands of the retaking the territories in Kharkiv region, where the most important thing was speed of the action. Locked in due to destruction of bridges, Russian troops around Kherson were unable to transfer reinforcements and equipment to the rapidly collapsing Kharkiv direction once the attack began, allowing Ukrainians to recapture the key towns of Izium, Balaklia, Kupiansk, and Liman. On September 9th, Ukrainians completely secured their positions in Blagodativka, controlling the river bank from here to Bilohirka. This allows them to cross the river at many different points, reducing the effectiveness of the Russian artillery and air strikes on pontoon bridges. At the 10th Separate Special Purpose and 205th Separate Motor Rifle Brigades that left Vysokopilne and Olhene are about to flee positions again after taking heavy casualties, the Russian command has to redeploy the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade to the north. This allows the Russians to slow down the Ukrainian advance here, but by September 12th they still lose Myrolubivka after a costly but ultimately successful attack of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. On the Ingulets River, the 35th and 36th Brigades push Russians from their positions, extending the lodgement area daily and reaching Bezemenne and Malasy Demenuha. On September 14th, Russia launches 8 Kinjal and Iskander ballistic missiles on Kryvyi Rih, targeting the local thermal power plant as well as dam on the Karachunovsky Reservoir. The dam was most likely a primary target, as the water level in Ingulets River starts rising after the strike. This could have potentially created issues for Ukrainian forces that set up pontoon bridges downstream. However, the damage is quickly mitigated, so the water level returns to normal by September 15th. The videos also indicate that Russians started actively using their new LMUR helicopter-launched air-to-surface guided missiles on river crossings. However, without much success, as even 4 of these missiles are unable to destroy one of the Ukrainian pontoon bridges located in Ternivka. Still, Russian helicopters remain a major threat, as they carefully hunt down Ukrainian vehicles that are far from the friendly SAM systems. Ukrainian aviation also continues flying the sorties, most involving pairs of Su-24s and Su-25s that conduct close air support. The regular deeper strikes, however, are still performed by HIMARS systems, as Russian long-range SAM systems, such as S-300s, are still present in the area, even though MiG-29s and Su-27s destroyed many short and medium-range SAMs with HARM missiles. During one of such SEAD missions, the Ukrainian MiG-29 is shot down on September 25th. The pilot, Taras Redkin, is killed in action. In 4 days, Ukrainians also lose one Su-24 bomber that was providing close air support near the village of Maximivka. While being already seriously damaged and in fire, the plane is engaged by 2 Russian surface-to-air missiles right before crashing. The beginning of the drone video, on which the crash was captured, also shows that the plane was attacked by 2 other missiles, and one of them likely damaged the engine, lighting it up. 2 pilots, however, survived, as their parachutes were filmed as well. Such videos clearly show how the abundance of manpads and other modern air defense systems on both sides make air superiority almost unachievable, as well as forces pilots to fly on extremely low altitudes. At this point, the ground battle enters the stalemate phase. As mentioned before, Russian attack aviation and artillery constantly pound the bridgehead through which Ukrainians are trying to transport as many troops as possible for further advance. Even though the first Russian defensive lines were crossed in a few places, advancing forces still have to traverse through massive minefields, which takes a lot of time and limits the use of mechanized forces. The most fierce battles are raging in the villages of Bezemenne, Kostromka and Bruskinske, as well as around Lyubimivka in the north. Russians even regain some positions in the south, but neither side can gain a decisive advantage at this point. At the beginning of October, the Ukrainian military command replaces Andriy Kovalchuk with Alexander Tarnavsky, expecting higher rates of advance from a new commander of this operation. As a side note, he was deputy of Alexander Syrsky, the colonel general who was brain behind Ukrainians' swift and successful breakthrough in the Kharkiv region. Meanwhile, under Kovalchuk's command, Ukrainians in the south have managed to ruin Russian logistics and degrade their defensive lines and formations. However, a different approach needed to deliver a decisive strike and rout the enemy. After a close inspection of current positions, Tarnavsky discovers a new place for the attack that Russians left unguarded. On October 1st, Ukrainian forces, meticulously regrouped by Tarnavsky, attack along the Dnipro River bank on the north. The attack is risky, as Ukrainians could be easily cut out from the friendly forces and destroyed on the river bank. For this reason, Russians never expected that Ukrainians would attempt such a breakthrough. The massive mechanized assault starts on the night of October 1st, when over 100 Ukrainian tanks and AFVs of the 57th Motorized, 17th Tank and 60th Mechanized Brigades charged towards unprepared Russian positions here. Under this onslaught, the only obstacle, the elite 10th Separate Special Purpose Brigade and some other smaller units, are destroyed right away. On the next day, Ukrainian mechanized forces continue their push without losing pace, entering Khroshchenivka, Arkhangelsk and Zolota Balka. Near Belaevka, they shot down the Russian K-52, one of the helicopters that are currently the only assets that Russians throw against them. On October 3rd, Ukrainians reached Novoalexandrivka, Avrilivka, Lyubimivka and Shevchenkivka. It becomes clear that Russians do not have sufficient reserves to mitigate such a breakthrough, so Ukrainian forces start freely maneuvering behind enemy lines. The recent advances in the area of Sukhy Stavok also hint that Russians in the north may soon end up in an encirclement. This sparks panic among all Russian units at their command, completely loses control over the situation. Long-awaited reserves are unable to cross Dnipro quickly due to destroyed bridges, while the rest of the troops on the right bank of the river are locked in heavy battles. Even the Russian artillery of the 227th Artillery Brigade and 140th Artillery Regiment could not support the disorganized infantry anymore and are driven back by rapidly advancing 17th, 57th and 60th Brigades. At this point, all Russian units in the area begin their race to the rear, abandoning armored vehicles, ammo warehouses, and killed comrades. Some even choose to surrender, seeing how their command handled the situation. On October 4th, Ukrainians liberated Blakitne, Petrivka, part of Duchany, and Ukrainka, as well as smaller nearby towns. Russians blow up the bridge in Duchany, so advancing forces fully control only the northern part of the village. The overall northern front line along the Inholets River also quickly crumbles, as on the same day Russians retreat from the villages of Davydiv Brid, Velika and Mala Alexandrivka, Starosilla, Novodmitrivka, Belyaevka, and Petropavlivka, as well as smaller nearby towns. On October 5th, the Ukrainian advance slows down, but already quite exhausted forces still reclaim the towns of Novogrigorivka, Novovasilievka, and Trifonivka. A particularly interesting engagement happens on this day between Novokamyanka and Duchany. Here, soldiers of the 4th Regiment of the 2nd Assault Battalion of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade on two BMP-2s, supported by a T-64 of 17th Separate Tank Brigade, engaged in a battle with 4 Russian T-90S tanks. This story was told by one of the Ukrainian soldiers engaged in the battle, and some parts of it supported by drone footage. Ukrainian small column advancing to the south in the direction of Sukhanovo village suddenly meets Russian reserves forces counting 4 tanks of the 34th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. Using smoke grenades, the Ukrainian tank approaches the enemy and, while being undetected, destroys one of the Russian T-90Ss from a close distance using 2 HE shells, one of the few pure tank duels of this war. Another T-90S rushes to come to a rescue, but witnesses the duel and decides to retreat. The other 2 Russian tanks cover this T-90 from a distance, pounding the supposed location where Ukrainian troops disembarked with a few shells. Being covered by bushes and trees, the Ukrainian tank retreats as well and starts firing in the direction of the enemy. After Ukrainian T-64 miraculously manages to damage another T-90S, Russians make a decision to retreat further. The next day, an unprecedentedly quick advance is concluded when Ukrainians cross the bridge over the water reservoir near Duchany, preventing the enemy from getting a formidable foothold behind this natural defensive line. At this point, Russians lost significant part of their lodgement area on the right bank of Dnipro River, as well as strong defensive lines on the Inholets River. These fortifications allowed them to hold significant Ukrainian forces on the other bank of the river and pound them with artillery and aviation for a while. Now, these forces are pushing Russians backwards, but the pace is slower since Ukrainians have to bring reserves closer and arrange new logistical lines. By October 9th, though Novokamyanka is liberated, Russian attempts to counterattack fail as their forces are short on all kinds of vehicles that were lost and simply abandoned during the retreat. Once again, rotating troops or supplying them with a new armor is impossible due to practically non-existent supply lines between Dnipro's right and left banks. Ukrainians also down a K-52 in the area of Sukhanove. Interestingly, it's only the second and the last Russian aircraft that was destroyed and photographed during the counteroffensive around Kherson, which means that they did not carry as many CAS missions here as on the other directions which were less critical. Now, the Russian command understands that it's only a question of time when Ukrainians will gather a new armored fist and renew the offensive. Nevertheless, for the rest of the October, they still choose to hold newly established and unfortified positions with already quite battered forces that become smaller every day. Such fighting continues for another month, while Russian officials reportedly point out that the city of Kherson was turned into a stronghold and will be defended at any cost.
Мы Херсон не отставим, не уйдем и будем защищать Херсон до конца.
In reality, however, no real efforts are made to prepare the city for a siege. So, at the beginning of November, it becomes clear to everyone that they were just delaying the inevitable. On November 9th, 2022, Russian military command declares that they are regrouping from the right bank of Dnipro River, officially concluding the battle.
Товарищ министр обороны, всесторонне оценив сложившуюся ситуацию, предлагается занять оборону по левому берегу реки Днепр. Понимаю, что это очень непростое решение. В то же время мы сохраним самое главное – жизни наших военнослужащих и в целом боеспособность группировки войск.
Сергей Владимирович, согласен с вашими выводами и предложениями. Приступайте к отводу войск и примите все меры, чтобы обеспечить безопасную переброску личного состава, вооружения и техники за реку Днепр.
Есть.
A few hours before this news, the deputy head of administration of the occupied region, Kirill Stremosov, dies in a car crash near Henichensk. Of course, by complete coincidence. Videos also indicate that a few days before that, all Russian flags disappeared from administrative buildings in Kherson, and all possessions of value were removed, or basically stolen, so Russians clearly tried to conduct a retreat in an organized manner. Worth mentioning that the deportation of Kherson citizens, started on October 18th, was also successful to some extent, but around 100,000 people were still left in the city. On November 10th, Ukrainian troops liberated Snegurivka, starting a cautious movement through abandoned Russian positions along the whole front line. Pontoon bridges which Russians use to escape are targeted by all kinds of Ukrainian artillery to inflict maximum casualties to the retreating enemy. Videos indicate that Russians left the Kherson area mostly by foot, so we can assume that leftovers of their military vehicles were abandoned as well. Soon, the photos and videos with hundreds of captured tanks, IFVs, APCs and IMVs of all kinds flood the internet, proving that the exodus from Kherson was indeed very costly for the defending side. Eventually, on November 11th, Russians blow up the heavily damaged Antonivka Road bridge to prevent a chase. Ukrainians, however, never planned it, as they are moving slowly due to destroyed bridges in the area and heavy mining. After thorough reconnaissance, the first units of the Ukrainian military entered Kherson on November 11th, ending over a half-year-long occupation. They are met with unprecedented gratitude and joy as the remaining citizens wave the Ukrainian flags that they did hide for the whole occupation period. At this point, Ukrainians reached a cusp of victory, which Russians would soon try to spoil by conducting artillery strikes across the river. Nevertheless, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Kherson on November 14th, meeting with residents and offering support.
How are you feeling today, Mr. President? How are you
feeling very well today.
How is this moment for you?
The moment is very important. That is the biggest city what was occupied since 24th of February. So that is the biggest city, and now it's free. So Ukraine came. So I'm happy. Thank you.
With the return of the city under Ukrainian control, the international and domestic investigators also started uncovering a significant number of war crimes that were committed during the occupation, including murders, kidnappings, and detention of hundreds of people in torture chambers. The Kherson city infrastructure was also destroyed before the Russian retreat, so the reintegration of the city after the 8-month-long occupation is a complex task, especially as shellings of the city are regularly conducted from the left bank of Dnipro River. In conclusion, the liberation of Kherson and the ejection of Russians from the right bank of the Dnipro River was a major victory for Ukraine. Active use of HIMARS MLRS put a significant strain on Russian logistics, preventing the transition of troops and supplies across the river. By degrading the capabilities of Russian military this way, Ukrainians got a key advantage that allowed them to rout the Russians in mechanized assault along the riverbank. This particular operation was as risky as it was successful, dealing irreversible damage to the enemy. It's also important to mention that losses of Ukrainians were quite high during the first months of the offensive, as troops faced quite formidable Russian defenses, elite enemy units, and devastating airstrikes. However, once Ukrainians began their fast advance in Kharkiv region, Russians were unable to reinforce the front lines there with troops from Kherson, making it a perfect trap. When Ukrainians reached the limits of their advance there, they focused on Kherson, creating conditions in which the enemy had a crucial dilemma: guaranteed military defeat in a face-to-face battle or a quick escape, abandoning large territories and loss of equipment without a fight. As it happens in any good dilemma, choosing the second option did lead to the same negative outcomes as choosing the first one. In conclusion, the battle for Kherson clearly showed that Ukrainians can adapt and conduct complex military operations, outmatching an enemy with a huge advantage in equipment numbers by superior tactics and smart use of modest resources.
Надо любоваться за тех ребят, которые этого момента не дождались.